From Torch to Tunisia, Part 1 and 2, narrated by Sasha Maggio. Starting next week, we will be covering the events of the Battle of Kasserine Pass. But before we get there, let's take a look at what has happened in North Africa since the U.S. troops arrived 80 years and a few months ago. Our British allies had been fighting in North Africa for over 2 years by the time we arrived. But for us, the American forces, the war in North Africa started with Operation Torch on 8 November 1942. Our objectives for Operation Torch and beyond included gaining control of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. And to accomplish this, we initially grouped our units into 3 task forces, as we discussed in November of last year's Why We Fight 1942 series. As our forces came ashore in Morocco and Algeria, our British friends with the 8th Army were working their way to meet us, pushing Rommel and his Africa Corps westward as well. Ideally, our forces would meet up with the British forces and we would crush Rommel in the middle. The British and American leadership had hoped the French in North Africa would not resist the invasion, but they did resist at every location our Allied forces came ashore. The lack of cohesion among the French forces likely made this resistance as ineffective as it was. Shortly after the initial invasion of Operation Torch, the American and British allies were able to establish an agreement of cooperation with the French, and we now had French forces to support the allies in the war. We also had to figure out how best to include them. The problem at this point is the American forces had their first taste of battle against European forces in Operation Torch, but this would not be a good example of the level of opposition to be faced when engaging Rommel's Africa Corps. General George C. Marshall had not wanted to commit American forces to the North Africa campaign, but FDR as Commander-in-Chief made the final decision. With American troops landing in North Africa, this could be perceived as a British win in the arguments over strategy. When FDR and Churchill and the combined chiefs of staff met in Casablanca in January 1943 to discuss the strategy we would use going forward from this point, General Marshall and the American planners again wanted to focus on a cross-channel invasion of Europe. Basically, we had committed to Operation Torch, so the British were happy. But now our generals and planners wanted to focus on what we deemed the more important task of the war, taking out Hitler and the Nazi regime and liberating occupied Europe in the process. And the British again won the argument when the decision was made to commit to Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. This would be followed by an invasion of the continent via Italy, with the goal of knocking Mussolini out of the war. British Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson assumed command of the forces that would be the British First Army, and American forces formed Second Corps under Lieutenant General Lloyd Fredenall. Lieutenant General Anderson and the British First Army would lead the initial drive into Tunisia with American and Free French forces in support. Major General George Patton and his Western Task Force remained in Morocco at this time to train and prepare. Some might wonder why a British general was chosen to lead the drive at this point, when there were plenty of American generals in the theater. Lieutenant General Anderson was considered a solid representative of the Allies' combat experience in North Africa. In contrast, none of the American generals had faced German forces yet, but the British had been fighting them for years. The decision made sense. Unlike the initial resistance faced in Operation Torch, the drive into Tunisia would be harder than expected, made even more challenging by a disorganized Allied chain of command, and the resentment harbored between the British and the French. The French forces were added to this coalition, but placing them under a British commander resulted in refusal of orders, among other frustrations. General Eisenhower was busy with political matters related to the transition of control of the French North African colonies, and none of the other American commanders in North Africa had the prestige or combat experience to be placed above Anderson. As a result, the enormous advantage of a unified direction supplied by a single commander was lost. Instead, a hopeless intermingling of the three Allied forces would soon develop along the front, a thoroughly unsound military practice. Within a day of landing in North Africa, the British First Army, along with various American elements, began their move eastward into Tunisia. By November 14th, Anderson had moved his forces into western Tunisia and planned to conduct attacks on Tunis and Bizerta within the week. The Allies, despite intelligence intercepts, grossly underestimated the strength and capabilities of the German forces opposing them in northern Tunisia, and failed to heed information that Axis forces were expanding their bridgehead to the west. Lieutenant General Anderson proceeded with his advance, either missing or ignoring the intelligence. The Allies would go on the offensive, cut through the Axis forces, first isolating Bizerta, capture Tunis, and then focus on Bizerta. This didn't happen. The American 1st Armored Division, with the British 1st Army, moved eastward from Oran, fighting small skirmishes in the desert and mountains in northern Tunisia through December 1942. But the Allies failed to split the German forces as planned and did not capture Tunis or Bizerta. Bad weather and logistics issues forced the Allies to postpone their planned offensive in December 1942, exacerbated by the struggle to coordinate air and ground operations, which in turn was exacerbated by the distance between usable airfields and the Tunisian front. With operations halted in northern Tunisia, Eisenhower looked further south as an area to potentially continue an Allied offensive. In the area between Tebessa and Kasserine, Eisenhower sought to give the American forces a front of their own, while reinforcing French forces in the region and putting up a potential roadblock against anticipated offensive action by Rommel's forces. During the last several weeks of 1942 and the first 6 weeks of 1943, both the Allied and Axis armies sparred along the front in an attempt to improve their respective positions in central Tunisia. By mid-January 1943, these moves by the Allies set the stage for what was to occur in the upcoming battles of Sidi Bouzid and Kasserine Pass. Several of the pictures and images used throughout this presentation come from the book World War II, Map by Map. Thank you for joining me today. The references included in the 2 Twitter threads presented here are linked below in the description. If you are a fan of this content, please consider subscribing to my accounts on any or all platforms, as that helps me know that the content is worth the effort. And stick around. This might be the best series yet.